You may be seated. We are starting a new sermon series today. So if you are interested, I'm going to be reading Psalm 33 for us this morning, and that is on page 870 in the blue Bibles that are around the sanctuary if you want to follow along. If not, you can just listen. Psalm 33. Sing joyfully to the Lord, you righteous. It's fitting for the upright to praise God. Praise the Lord with harp. Make music on the 10-string lyre. Sing a new song. Play skillfully and shout for joy. For the word of the Lord is right and true, faithful in all God does. The Lord loves righteousness and justice. The earth is full of unfailing love. By the word of the Lord were the heavens made, the starry hosts by the breath of God's mouth. God gathers the waters of the sea into jars, puts the deep into storehouses. Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let the people of the world revere God. For God spoke, and it came to be, commanded, and it stood firm. The Lord foils the plans of the nations, thwarts the purposes of the peoples. But the plans of the Lord stand firm forever, the purposes of God's heart through all generations. I am fascinated with different types of speech, and especially the imagery that we use in speech. A lot of people know what metaphors are. They're like word pictures. And I sort of keep track of interesting ones that show up, whether it's in the news or the media or movies or songs. When something becomes so familiar that we almost don't catch that it's poetic language, I like to take special note of it and save it for moments when people are being very, sometimes, I don't know if you've met people, but sometimes people can be they can be stinkers. I'm from Ohio, we call people stinkers. I don't know in southern Idaho if there's a more regional term, but sometimes people can be a little tough to deal with and prickly, and they can get very resistant to ideas that they encounter that maybe they don't agree with right away. And so one of the funny things that happens is they will get bogged down or hyper-focused on the kind of language that's being used. But I find it in all sorts of areas of life. Like, for instance, somebody will watch a movie that they don't like, and they'll describe it as like dog food. And you'll say, what does that mean? Well, it wasn't very good. And then somebody might contest them and say, well, why don't you just say that? Like, what would you prefer that I say? Like, I didn't like that movie very much? Like, that's sort of boring. But often the person says, well, why don't you use like 3 out of 10? That would give me a better picture, right? Then we try and make it very mathematical, instead of dog food, right? But dog food's more expressive and sort of fun, and you get the gist, unless you're being a stinker, of course. In sports, we'll say things like, boy, they just ran into a buzzsaw. You'll say, wow, why would they willingly run into a buzzsaw? You say, no, it's a figure of speech. The other team just tore them apart. Really? Like they tore their limbs off? No. The other team was just much better than they were. Well, why don't you just say that? Right? Or give me the score. Okay, it was 33-3. Why are you being such a stinker? Right? When we get very particular about the kind of language. I notice it a lot in politics. We do it a lot in politics. But here's the funny thing, is that a lot of people know what a metaphor is, right? It's one thing that stands in for another thing. But the part of speech that I really like is called a metonym. And it's one thing that stands for a much bigger thing, or everything. And we do this a lot in politics. For instance, we'll say something like 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. But we don't mean the address, right? We don't mean a street address. We mean The White House, maybe. But we also don't mean the White House. That's another metonym. We mean what happens in the government, the president and the cabinet. But we use all sorts of word pictures and poetic language when we talk about politics. You'll notice it. I don't know if you're aware, it's an election year. And so, I'm glad you laughed at that. If you watch the commercials, but especially there's a debate this week, or if you see different things coming up, listen for the word pictures that are used. Because in politics, we often don't use exacting language, like mathematical language. Sometimes we do. But often, we use very poetic, picture-based, right? Because it's more evocative. It draws something out of us. It gets a response from us. And so poetic word picture language can be very powerful. We do it when it comes to things like love or emotions. Like sometimes people will say, and then the waterworks started. They mean tears, right? The waterworks. But if you were like a scientific person, you might say, technically, you have to push up your glasses. Actually, tears aren't water, right? And you're like, dude, don't be such a stinker. It's not the point. The point is, I started crying, right? It's don't police my language. I'm trying to express something. We do it when it comes to war. Whenever we talk about war, we use poetic or image-based language a lot. It's because war is so consequential and sometimes so unimaginable in its scope and impact that it's easier to talk about it with some poetic or word pictures or image-based things. For instance, my favorite one, and I absolutely love this phrase, is the phrase boots on the ground. You familiar with this phrase? I love the phrase boots on the ground. We're always trying to avoid boots on the ground. We do not want to put boots on the ground. Now, let's be honest, it's a metonym because the problem isn't shoes, right? The problem isn't footwear. Like, for instance, if over Iraq or Taiwan or China, if we dropped 1,000 boots and there were 1,000 boots on the ground, that wouldn't be a problem. It's who's in the boots. You follow me? We use metonyms and word pictures all the time to talk about things that are big, outsized, that require sort of an over-imagination, or that are very consequential. We're very, very familiar with this kind of poetic, image-based language. In fact, the reason I bring this up is that we're so familiar with it and so comfortable that we often don't even realize that we are interpreting what somebody is saying. We don't even catch that we're so practiced, so good and skilled at interpreting poetic or image-based language, we don't even know we're doing it. It's almost become second nature. It's muscle memory, right? It's something we don't have to calculate and say, hold on a second, let me think about that word picture and what you're saying, what you're trying to convey to me, and then I'll try and formulate my response. It happens just second nature. The problem is, when something becomes so embedded, so embodied, that it is second nature, right? It's just built in, we don't catch that we're doing it, and it goes unexamined. And when things are unexamined, they can become very difficult to lift up, sort of a pattern, and then to utilize it in a different setting. So what I would like to do over the next 10 weeks is I want to present to you a way of understanding faith or practice or religion that is called a theopoetic. It's a image-based or poetic way of approaching or interpreting or thinking about the way that you and I believe as individuals and as a community and walk out faith, practice our faith together. I want to try and present to you and convince you that the theopoetic is a beautiful way forward in the world because it is able to avoid all of that religious baggage that so many of us cringe at when our relatives or our friends or our coworkers or our neighbors bring it up, whether they're really into religion. You ever met somebody who's really into religion? It can be a bit much, right? And I'm saying this as a minister. Like, this is my full-time job, and sometimes I'm like, easy, right? Why don't you switch to decaf, brother? But also when people are really against religion. And I don't know if you've ever talked to somebody who's against religion, but they sure have a lot of ammunition. There is no end of the supply of examples of bad or hurtful, harmful religion. By the way, I just used a metonym. I said ammunition, right? And you all just second nature knew what I was talking about. I wasn't talking about literal ammunition, right? It's just how we talk. But when it comes to religion, sometimes we try to keep the language in a very tight box. We want it to be more exacting. I'm going to confess this. Sometimes when I'm talking to people about their spiritual life, their religious experience, their practice of faith, it sounds to me like they would prefer if it was a math formula or a worksheet or an invoice than what it is, which is sort of a story that we've been invited into, a dream that we wake up and find out we're a character in, right? It's very abstract. And it's very elusive sometimes. And it can be really hard to sort of articulate or formulate what it is about spirituality or religion or faith that motivates us, forms us, inspires us, limits us. So the theopoetic is a way for me that I have found opens up a way forward into a life of faith while avoiding the ditch on either side of the road. I'm going to say that again. For me, the theopoetic is a way forward in faith while avoiding the ditch on either side of the road. Here are, in my opinion, the ditches that we want to avoid on either side. There are lots of people who have been taught or raised in a way that when we say something like, God told me, or the word of the Lord, something like that, like in the passage we read here in Psalm 33. He used the word of the Lord 3 different times. That some people have become so overly familiar with this idea that God speaks to us, that they've made it very concrete and formulaic, and they hold on to their concept of it and their experience of it so tightly that it begins to feel like a weapon and that they can hit you over the head with it. Like, you ever heard of Bible thumpers, right? That people get beat over the head, browbeat with this idea. And so, we have to be careful because for some people, they love the religious structure that gives them a confidence and a certainty that God is in control and God has led them in how to live, and God speaks to them and leads them and guides them in their everyday decisions. And for them, it becomes this really heavy, concrete thing that is not negotiable, it cannot be debated, and they're certain about it. I was raised that way. I practiced that for much of my early life of faith. I understand the appeal of that. And there are times, let's be honest, where, like for instance, if somebody were to come up to me and say, God told me to give you $1,000 for this ministry that you've been praying about. I'm probably not going to turn down that money just because I'm suspicious of the epistemology, the way that they got there, the way of knowing. I'm not going to at that point argue with them and say, well, let's talk about this idea that God told you something. Like, did you hear an audible voice? Was there writing on the wall? Did you have a vision? Did God email you? If so, can I have her email address? Right? At that point, I'm not going to argue with the person about how they think God told them. I'm going to take the $1,000. But let's be honest. If somebody came and said, God told me that you're supposed to give me your car, then I'm going to say, hold on. Boop, boop, boop. Let's back up a little bit. What do you mean God told you? By the way, this happens all the time during this month of the year at Bible colleges all across the country. It's amazing how God will tell young men that that young woman is to be his wife. It's like I saw memes, tons of memes this week on social media making fun of that idea. So when somebody says, God told me, you do have to say, can we just pause for a second? Walk me through that. How did God tell you? All right? So for me, one ditch to the side of the road on our way forward is going to be that confident, concrete, tightly held confidence that becomes very formulaic, that if you're the right person and you live rightly and you worship the right God with a right heart, then God will lead and guide you, right? It's that kind of confidence I want to steer away from. I want to have a more poetic, open-ended, more loosely guarded way of interacting with the divine and the leading of God's Spirit in the world, okay? But here's the other ditch I want to avoid. There are a lot of people who, in a scientific, technological, enlightenment worldview, have said, look, this psalm is probably about 3,000 years old, right? And the ancients thought certain things about the world that we just don't believe anymore. We've sort of moved on, right? And so one of the things that has happened is that some people have moved on from the idea that there is a God and that God speaks to us, guides and leads us. So I want to say to that person, you're right. There are things that we know that the ancients didn't know. But friend, be careful, because there are things that the ancients knew that we have forgotten. And we suffer for not knowing. So those are the two extremes that I'm hoping to navigate through in the next 10 weeks. The conversation I would love to have with you is, how does God speak to us, lead and guide us in the 21st century? Part of the reason that I identify as a progressive Christian is because I understand that we don't see the world the same as those who wrote the Bible saw the world. We know some things they didn't know. And so we have to update and evolve and change and progress, right? And at the same time, I'm a progressive Christian. I'm not just a progressive. I also want to hold to the kind of faith that transformed them and led them to transform the world. And that's why I hold these two things, not in tension, but in partnership. The reason that I have embraced a theopoetic approach to faith and life and community and worship is because I am very interested in saying, when the psalmist talks about the word of the Lord, I understand that 3,000 years ago, they may have meant this or that. But I need to hear the word of the Lord in my life today. And I know that it's not a radio station you can tune into. I know that it's not going to be an email that shows up tomorrow morning. It might come as a dream, but with modern psychology, then I have to analyze the dream and wonder if it was just the pepperoni pizza I had the night before, right? And I second guess myself. So I'm not interested in either one of those extremes. I'm not interested in saying, if you read the Bible and you're a good person and you act forward in faith, bop, 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 there's your mathematical formula. I can't do that sort of a misplaced concreteness. But I also am not interested in this enlightenment, scientific, technological approach that says there is nothing going on in the world except what you can see and measure and explain. I want to say there is a divine presence in the world. And I don't know how exactly it works, but I am very interested that if there is a divine, a spirit, a presence, I would love to know how that thing we call God or the eternal would lead and guide a people today. How we as individuals might be able to tune in to whatever that frequency or that signal is and know a better way forward. Here's my final thing. If people listen to music and say, that song really speaks to me, that's a theopoetic to me. That's a poetic way of saying that. Because I don't want to dissect it and pull it apart. The problem with dissecting things is they have to be dead, right? Like if you dissect a frog, you kill the frog, right? I'm not interested in dissecting people's faith or life experience. I don't want to kill it to understand how it works. But I want to say, talk me through that, walk me through that. Or if people look at a piece of art and they say, this speaks to me. Well, they're using a poetic, right? They're not saying that the art talks to them. They're saying it resonates with them. It vibrates on some frequency that echoes something that's going on inside of them. They connect with it in a different way. That's the kind of imagery, poetry, language that I'm interested in harnessing so that you and I can have a conversation that says, how would God or the divine or the eternal reveal something to us in the 21st century? If God were to speak, or what the Israelites called the word of the Lord, it nourished them. And if we are people who are starving for meaning and spiritual depth and connection, human connection, what's the equivalent of their word of the Lord? How would God speak to us in the 21st century? And I have 9 ideas about how that happens, and I would love to run them past you. So over the next couple months, I would love to present an idea and have a conversation with you about things and ways that we, as a theopoetic people, might have an approach that allows us to, with some level of humility mixed with confidence, walk forward in faith while avoiding the ditch on either side of the road.